Imagine you're 26 years old, you're sitting in this corner office on Wall Street, you're the youngest senior vice president at this really prestigious financial firm, and, you are making just more money than you could ever possibly spend.
Right, like your whole life is completely mapped out at that point.
Exactly, completely mapped out. Now, imagine just throwing that guaranteed golden ticket away to sell books
Yeah.
out of a cramped, poorly ventilated garage.
Yeah, using a totally unproven technology too.
Right, a brand new technology that honestly most people at the time thought was just a passing fad.
It sounds completely irrational when you framed it like that, and I think that's exactly why the myth of the overnight billionaire is so appealing to us.
Oh, for sure.
We just love to, strip away the calculated risk and replace it with this romanticized idea of like a lone genius struck by lightning in a garage who just suddenly builds an empire out of thin air.
Yeah, it's a very clean cinematic narrative. But the thing is, it completely ignores the actual mechanics of how a behemoth company is constructed.
Yeah.
So today we're tossing that movie script out the window.
Good, because reality is way more interesting anyway.
Exactly. We're looking at a massive stack of source material today, and it's anchored by this really comprehensive case study called the Bezos Blueprint, from garage startup to global empire. And look, our goal here isn't to glorify Jeff Bezos.
No, not at all.
Our mission for this deep dive is to extract the highly specific, incredibly pragmatic frameworks he used to build Amazon. We're going to examine, the psychology behind his billion-dollar failures and look objectively at the friction that comes with scaling a company to the size of a nation state. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
If we are dismantling the myth, I feel like we have to start by tearing down the first major misconception, which is this idea that he came from absolutely nothing and built his company purely on desperate hustle.
Right, yeah, the whole rags to riches trope.
Yeah.
The documentation we have shows a very different reality. I mean, yes, he was born in Albuquerque in 1964 to a teenage mother, Jacqueline. But the real foundational influence comes shortly after, when she married Miguel, or Mike, Bezos.
Right, his adopted father.
Exactly. Mike was a Cuban immigrant who arrived in America at 16, spoke absolutely no English, and just systematically built a highly successful life from scratch. He eventually adopted Jeff. But what's crucial here isn't just the standard hard work narrative. It's the specific type of mindset Jeff was absorbing from his family.
Yeah, and you really see that mindset crystallize during those summers he spent at his grandparents' ranch in Texas. From what the case study highlights, his grandfather didn't run that ranch like, a modern consumer.
No, not all right.
Like if a tractor broke down, the attitude wasn't, oh, let's call a mechanic. The attitude was, let's take the transmission apart, figure out how it works, and just build a fix ourselves.
And that right there is the genesis of his entire worldview.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he wasn't just learning grit on that ranch. He was learning systems thinking.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, like a consumer looks at a broken machine and gets
Yeah.
frustrated, right? But an engineer looks at a broken machine, reverse engineers the problem, and builds a solution. And Bezos carried that exact framework into his education. He was a high school valedictorian in 1982, and then he went to Princeton, graduating summa cum laude in electrical engineering and computer science.
Which, perfectly explains why he ends up on Wall Street at D.E. Shaw. He was brilliant at algorithmic thinking, which financial firms just absolutely love.
Right, they pay top dollar for that.
Exactly. But this brings us back to that 26-year-old in the corner office in 1994. He notices that internet usage is growing at this staggering rate, something like 2,300% a year.
Which is just an astronomical number.
Right. And most people would look at that and think, cool, I can send emails faster now. But he looked at it as a fundamental infrastructure shift.
Exactly. And notice the methodology of his thinking here. He didn't have this burning passion to sell books,
Right. He wasn't like a huge bookstore guy.
No. He didn't start with a product. He started with a technological shift. He basically asked himself, what specific type of business model can actually exploit this new infrastructure?
But, seeing a trend and actually betting your entire life on it are two very different things. Leaving D.E. Shaw for the early internet is like, I don't know, jumping off a luxury cruise ship into a tiny, untested dinghy in the middle of a hurricane.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Thanks. It's one thing to take a massive swing when you're flat broke and have absolutely nothing to lose. But how does someone psychologically justify risking a guaranteed multi-million-dollar career path?
Well, he used a mental algorithm. He realized that traditional pros and cons lists are kind of, Well, they're completely useless for existential life choices because they're heavily weighted by short-term fear.
Okay, that makes sense.
So he invented what he called the regret minimization framework. He imagined himself as an 80-year-old man looking back on his life, and he asked a very binary question. He said, at 80, will I regret trying to participate in the internet and failing? And the answer was no.
Right.
But then he asked, will I regret never trying at all? And the answer to that was a definitive yes.
Okay, I get the philosophical appeal of that. I really do. But let's push back on it pragmatically for a second. Minimizing your regrets as an 80-year-old sounds incredibly profound, but how does projecting yourself half a century into the future actually help you pay the rent when you've just abandoned your Wall Street salary?
Fair point.
It feels almost, I don't know, dangerously detached from reality for normal people.
Well, it's not detached. It's really just a recalculation of risk. What's fascinating here is that the framework actually forces you to define what real risk is. To Bezos, the financial risk of going bankrupt at 30 was temporary. It was recoverable.
Because he could just go back to Wall Street if he failed.
It's exactly. But the psychological risk of missing out on the biggest technological revolution in human history, that was permanent. That was fatal. So once he neutralized the short-term fear of failure, the engineering mindset immediately kicked back in. He didn't just blindly quit and start wandering around. He calculated the exact ecosystem he needed to survive the experiment.
Right, which totally destroys another huge myth, which is this idea of the spontaneous road trip. He and his then-wife, Mackenzie Scott, didn't just drive west for the scenery.
Right, they had a very specific destination in mind.
Yeah, they specifically targeted Seattle. The case study notes they chose it because of its deep pool of tech talent and its proximity to Microsoft. He was literally writing the business plan on a laptop in the passenger seat while she drove. He was calculating the supply chain before they even had a product.
And that brings us to the product itself, the wedge strategy, which, fun fact, he initially wanted to call the company Cadabra.
Like abracadabra.
Yeah, exactly. But thankfully, someone told him it sounded way too much like Cadabra over the phone.
Oh, man. Yeah, that would have been terrible branding.
Terrible. So he settled on Amazon, reflecting the largest river in the world, signaling massive scale. But why books? Why did he start there?
Because physical bookstores have a hard biological limit, right? If you build the biggest mega bookstore in the real world, you might fit, 150,000 titles in it?
Mm.
But there are millions of books in print. An infinite catalog of physical items is physically impossible to stock in a real store.
Exactly. The internet, however, has no square footage limits. The database is infinite. He realized he could create a store that was physically impossible to build in the real world. That was the wedge. Offer a selection so massive that no local competitor could ever match it.
But creating the impossible requires capital. And this is where we really have to inject a massive dose of reality into the whole startup myth, because he did not bootstrap this with pocket change.
No, he certainly did not.
His parents, Mike and Jacqueline, invested roughly $300,000 of their life savings into this idea. And to his credit, Bezos was brutally honest with them. He told them there was a 70% chance they would lose every single dime.
And the crazy thing is, they didn't even understand the internet.
I mean, who did in 1994?
Very few people. They invested entirely because they were betting on their son's execution skills, not the technology. But even with that seed money, he needed more to scale. He took over 50 meetings just to scrape together his first $1 million from angel investors.
I try to picture those meetings, and it honestly just hurts my brain. Imagine pitching an online mega store to wealthy investors in 1994, most of whom probably didn't even own a desktop computer, let alone know what a web browser was.
It's wild to think about.
How do you sell a vision when the basic infrastructure for it barely even exists in the minds of the people you're asking for money?
You don't sell the present, you sell the inevitable. He wasn't pitching a bookstore, he was pitching a total shift in human behavior. He had to absorb constant rejection from people asking, well, what exactly is the internet?
Yeah.
But his conviction was absolute. And in July 1995, operating out of that tiny Bellevue garage, Amazon launched.
And the myth of the garage usually focuses on the whole door desks thing, right? They famously couldn't afford real desks, so Bezos bought cheap wooden doors from Home Depot, nailed 4 4x4s to them, and used those as workstations.
Yeah, it's a cute story that gets repeated endlessly in startup culture.
But looking at the sources, the door desk wasn't just this quirky, fun startup thing. It was a deeply ingrained capital allocation strategy, wasn't it?
Precisely. It became a lasting symbol of extreme frugality for the company. The underlying mechanism was this. Every single dollar spent on fancy office furniture is a dollar that is not spent on acquiring a customer or improving the supply chain. If an expense doesn't directly improve the customer experience, you just don't make it.
And that ruthless focus worked. Within 4 weeks of launching, without any major press or marketing budget, they had shipped books to all 50 states and 45 different countries.
Which is just incredible traction.
Yeah. They proved the thesis. If you remove friction, people will buy things on a computer screen. But that early success triggered a totally new, terrifying phase, didn't it? Because explosive growth requires explosive spending.
Which leads right to their IPO in May 1997. They go public at $18 a share. And the metrics they had were just staggering. Revenue had jumped 838% in a single year to nearly $148 million. And they had 1.5 million customers.
Wow.
And this is the exact moment Bezos coined his famous Day One philosophy in his first letter to shareholders.
Right. The core of Day One is treating the company, no matter how gigantic it gets, with the exact same ferocious urgency, curiosity, and terror of obsolescence as a startup operating out of a garage.
Yes.
If you ever accept that you've quote-unquote made it, you enter Day Two, and Day Two is stasis, followed by irrelevance, followed by death.
It's a really powerful philosophy, but adhering to it as a newly public company is basically psychological warfare. Wall Street operates on 90-day earnings cycles. Investors buy stock because they want to see quarterly profits. They want their dividends.
Yeah.
But Bezos flat out refused to optimize for the quarter. He poured every single cent of revenue right back into the machine. Bigger warehouses, better software, more servers.
So what does this all mean for the investors? Because in the year 2000, the dot-com bubble violently bursts, the NASDAQ Q crashes, Amazon's stock price plummets from over $100 a share down to like $6.
Yeah, it was a bloodbath.
Financial analysts are publicly crucifying him. They're calling it Amazon.bomb. And I have to be honest, if I'm an early investor watching the stock lose 90% of its value while the CEO absolutely refuses to turn a profit, Bezos looks completely delusional.
Oh, totally.
It is incredibly hard to distinguish between a visionary playing a 20-year game and an arrogant CEO driving a company straight off a cliff.
It is the ultimate crucible for leadership. And you're right. From the outside, it looked like a catastrophic failure. Yeah. But internally, Bezos was looking at very different metrics. The stock price was crashing, yes, but customer retention was up, order frequency was up, the cost of fulfilling an order was actually going down. This highlights his seventh core principle from the case study, which is be stubborn on the vision, flexible on execution.
Meaning the vision was to be Earth's most customer-centric company. And the execution was just the day-to-day survival through a massive market crash.
Exactly. While critics screamed that they were just a money-losing website selling discount books, Bezos understood something they didn't. The website was just the storefront. The actual empire, the true structural moat, was the physical infrastructure they were building in the real world.
The massive fulfillment centers, the logistics software, the distribution networks.
Right. Once you build a machine that can efficiently deliver a book to anyone on Earth in 2 days, you could push literally anything through that exact same machine.
And surviving that crash is what gave him the foundation to transition Amazon from a simple retailer into a global platform. They moved beyond books into CDs, electronics, toys, clothes, you name it. But to scale at that level, you can't just play it safe. You have to take terrifyingly large risks. And the sources heavily emphasize his reliance on what they call asymmetric bets.
Yes. An asymmetric bet is a structural concept where your downside is capped, but your upside is theoretically infinite.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, in a traditional corporate environment, if a CEO risks $100 million on a new project and it fails, they get fired. So nobody takes big risks. In Bezos' model, you willingly risk $100 million on an experiment because if it works, it generates $10 billion.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because he basically started operating a high-stakes venture capital firm inside of a low-margin retail business.
Well, that's exactly what it was.
Let's look at how they applied this. First, they launch Amazon Marketplace. They allow third-party competing businesses to sell their own products directly on Amazon's website. Traditional retail logic says this is suicide. Like, why would you let a competitor sell in your own store?
Because of platform economics. It goes back to the infinite catalog we talked about. Amazon couldn't afford to buy and warehouse every single product in the world themselves. But by letting third parties take the inventory risk, Amazon instantly multiplied their selection, charged a fee for the transaction, and cemented themselves as the default starting point for literally any internet search.
Then comes Amazon Prime in 2005. And this is purely psychological genius. You pay an upfront annual fee, which was originally $79 for quote-unquote free 2-day shipping.
Right, which wasn't actually free for Amazon.
No. At first, Amazon lost a fortune on freight costs. But once a customer pays that sunk cost, their psychology shifts entirely. They feel like they must buy everything from Amazon to justify the $79 they already spent. It locked in consumer loyalty on an unprecedented scale.
It really did. Then you have the Kindle in 2007, which was an asymmetric bet on controlling the actual hardware ecosystem, not just the physical media. But honestly, the most staggering asymmetric bet in the company's history, and perhaps the history of modern business, was AWS, or Amazon Web Services, which launched in 2006.
Explain the mechanics of AWS, because for a long time, the average person didn't even know it existed, yet it completely transformed the global internet.
Okay, so to run Amazon's massive retail operations, they had to build an incredibly complex, sprawling back end of servers and computing power. It was like they built a massive 10-lane private highway just for their own delivery trucks.
Okay.
Bezos looked at this internal infrastructure and realized two things. First, they had excess capacity. Second, every other startup in the world was going to need computing power, and building it themselves was just way too expensive.
Wait, so instead of just using their 10-lane highway, they set up toll booths and let every other business in the world drive on it.
Exactly. They productized their own infrastructure. You can now rent server space by the hour from Amazon. Today, AWS powers a massive portion of the entire internet. It's a high-margin cloud computing juggernaut that essentially became the profit engine funding Amazon's retail expansion for years.
But a system designed to take massive swings is mathematically guaranteed to generate massive misses, right? And the case study doesn't hide the failures. In 2014, they launched the Fire phone to compete with Apple, and it was an unmitigated disaster.
Oh, a total flop.
They had to write off hundreds of millions of dollars in unsold inventory. They also launched Amazon restaurants, various healthcare initiatives, early video game studios, all of which failed spectacularly. My question is, how does a corporate culture survive a highly public, multi-hundred-million-dollar humiliation like the Fire phone without the entire company becoming paralyzed by a fear of being fired?
By fundamentally changing the definition of failure. Bezos explicitly communicated to his shareholders and his employees that failure and invention are inseparable twins. If you know exactly how an experiment is going to turn out, it isn't an experiment.
That's a good point.
He argued that as a company grows, everything needs to scale, including the size of its failed experiments. If a multi-billion-dollar company isn't failing on a multi-million-dollar scale, they aren't swinging hard enough. One AWS pays for 100 Fire phones. If you punish the team that built the Fire phone, you send a chilling effect to the entire organization, and you guarantee that no one will ever invent the next AWS.
That is just a masterclass in psychological safety at scale. But, the machine worked almost too well. Those successful asymmetric bets compounded, and Amazon evolved from an online bookstore into a global empire. And the sources for this deep dive are clear. We have to look objectively at the reality of what that scale creates. You cannot study success of this magnitude without examining the friction it generates in society.
Absolutely. When a company transitions from being a market participant to being the underlying market infrastructure, the scrutiny intensifies exponentially. And the documentation outlines very substantial, thoroughly researched criticisms.
Right, and we are looking at this impartially as a function of scale.
Exactly. There is intense regulatory and public scrutiny regarding the physical toll on workers inside the fulfillment networks. There are massive antitrust investigations regarding their market power and whether they utilize data from third-party sellers to unfairly launch competing products.
Yeah, and there are significant ongoing debates about the environmental impact of a global next-day logistics network.
Right. It's impossible to ignore.
When you become an apex predator in business, you attract apex scrutiny. It is just the physics of operating at that scale. And as the company became this sprawling, automated entity, Bezos himself began looking past the retail horizon. In 2013, he buys the Washington Post for $250 million, instantly becoming a major player in global media. And he founds Blue Origin, an aerospace company focused on reusable rockets.
Which perfectly illustrates his final major framework, which is decadal thinking. Most CEOs think in quarters. Bezos thinks in 10, 20, or 50-year timelines. The stated goal of Blue Origin isn't just to launch satellites. It is to build the heavy-lifting infrastructure required to move highly polluting industries entirely off Earth and into space over the next century.
This raises an important question, though. At what point does a founder's mindset shift from worrying about the unit economics of toothbrush delivery to engineering a 50-year roadmap for human spaceflight? In 2021, he steps down as CEO of Amazon, handing the reins to Andy Jassy, who, crucially, was the architect behind AWS.
Right. Very telling.
Bezos transitions to executive chair to focus on Blue Origin, the Post, and massive philanthropic vehicles like the Bezos Earth Fund. It really forces you to reevaluate what he was actually doing in that garage back in 1994.
Because another core principle is build systems, not just products. This raises an important question about what Amazon really is. He wasn't just building an e-commerce site. He was mastering the art of building scalable, self-sustaining technological ecosystems. Once you understand the underlying physics of how to build an infrastructure system, whether that's a logistics network for cardboard boxes or a cloud network for data, you can apply that exact same systems thinking to orbital rockets.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from the Bezos blueprint. If you are listening to this, staring down your own massive projects or career pivots, the lesson isn't that you need a flawless billion-dollar idea fully formed in your head before you start. Books were just a wedge, a pragmatic entry point. The real genius was having the engineering mindset to identify a massive infrastructural shift, using the regret minimization framework to conquer the fear of jumping in, and then relentlessly building systems to survive the chaos.
It's about creating a personal culture where you're willing to take asymmetric bets on yourself, knowing that most of them might fail, but one might change absolutely everything.
Exactly. So look at your own life. Where are you optimizing for short-term comfort instead of long-term regret? What is the one asymmetric bet you could make this year where the downside is just a bruised ego, but the upside is a completely different trajectory?
And as you map out those bets, I want to leave you with one final structural thought to explore on your own. If Jeff Bezos' ultimate weapon was the day one mentality, maintaining the ferocious, desperate urgency and endless experimentation of a tiny startup, is it actually biologically possible for a sprawling global empire that employs over 1 million people and functions as basic societal infrastructure to truly remain in day one? Or does a corporate entity inevitably become day two the very moment its systems are so massive and heavily regulated that they dictate how the world operates?
A massive question for a massive empire. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the blueprint, the mechanics, and the reality of scale. Keep reverse engineering the problems in front of you. Keep minimizing those regrets, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.